Welcome to Old Path and our study through the Old Testament book of Proverbs. We are in chapter 13 today, and before we get to the text, a couple of things we've started recently here on the program of kind of just working through questions that pop up around our walk with the Lord, and just, I guess you could say, they're questions that get brought up again and again, just kind of in our discussions with people and the way that we kind of reason through I guess you could say even reasoning through our faith. So I want to get to one of those in a minute. Also to make you aware, I've been announcing our trip to Israel for quite some time now, but we are at that point where people need to put in for their time off from work. We're going to be going as planned on the 10th of March, assuming, of course, that everything is calm as it's supposed to be there. A lot is going to be taking place between now and the inauguration, and probably a couple of weeks thereafter. So anyway, if things hold and it's safe for us to travel, we'll be going. If we had to postpone it, which we have a couple of times in this last year, we would, of course, do that. We won't go if it's unsafe. So if you have any questions about any of that, then please contact me. Let me know about that. And any questions you might have, let me know. And you can do that through the ministry's website, which is oldpaththeology.net. And I will be happy to go over all the details with you. I can send you the paperwork on it, which is the itinerary and all of those kind of things. So just would love to have you come along with us. It's the trip is open. We have spaces available, so I can get you the details on that. So here we are in a new year. Lots going on. I want to once again thank all of those who support the ministry through, some do so financially, others do so through prayer, some do both. Any various ways that you do. I want to start off the year by thanking everybody who does any of the above, and we are grateful for you doing that and for being a part of the ministry that's here. We really appreciate your questions, if you have any, or those kind of things like what I'm going to do here in just a moment. If there's some kind of a thing that's just a simple question, but you never get a satisfactory answer to it, hopefully I can provide one. I know it might sound prideful that you haven't gotten one so far, but hopefully I can provide one. But I would like to address it. If it's something that you have and you think it's worth discussing on the program, I'd love to be able to do that. So if you haven't subscribed to the channel, I would hope that you do, and would love to have you along with our studies through the Old and the New Testament. Every week we do one of each, and so right now currently we're in Proverbs, obviously, and on Thursdays we're going through the book of Revelation. When we are done with that and done with Proverbs, we go on to Ecclesiastes. When we're done with Revelation, we will circle around back to the beginning of the New Testament in the book of Matthew. So at all times, working through both Old and New Testament, very, very important that we do that, I believe. It's the model that I have been introduced to 40 years ago, and it's about all that I've ever really known. So almost 40 years. I haven't quite got there yet, but it's this year, 85, was when we first started going to Calvary Chapel of Cyprus. So this will be 40 years later on this year that we started going there. Anyhow, just wow, nostalgia. Anyway, with all that being said, just so much that's taking place. In Proverbs 13, you can start making your way there, and I just wanted to address something that got brought up and just earlier today, speaking with this wonderful brother, just kind of working our way through these discussions that come up all the time, and there's just there shouldn't be any kind of questions or wondering about this. I think we should be able to just rest upon what the Word has to say. And here's the upshot of what we're getting at here. There is when we think of apologetics, and when we say apologetics comes from the Greek word apologia, it's the way of us giving a defense for what it is that we believe. So whatever it is that we believe, whether we're saying it to someone else or if we're just trying to settle it in our own mind, one of the golden rules of understanding and interpreting what the Scripture has to say is we take the things that are more difficult in light of what is more easy to understand or more simple. And a great example of that, and again, there are some denominations that, man, when you walk in the doors of that place, you know exactly what you're going to hear on this particular topic. So it's very simply this. what about any particular action or something that we might do that would be somehow disqualifying to us as far as our faith is concerned? And so the hypotheticals are myriad. I mean, you can hear so many different things that people will look at and say, well, but what if I do this, and if that's not confessed and I meet the Lord, but I haven't confessed that particular sin, what's going to become of me? And so without getting into details about all the different ones that people put out, let's do that thing where we just say, what is the simplest thing for me to be able to settle in my mind? First of all, salvation comes by belief. It's salvation by grace through faith. That's what Paul tells us in Ephesians 2:8. By grace you've been saved through faith. It is not your work. It's nothing that you've done. It's not of your works. It is the gift of God. So he doesn't leave any wiggle room in that. So I don't care what people want to throw out. They're going to usually throw out James chapter 2, James chapter 1, those different things about justification and all the rest. That's after the fact. Those are things that are going to give evidence that God has done this work in you, but by grace you've been saved. So if we start to throw in those kind of things, well, what about if I do this? Well, if you doing whatever it may very well be disqualifies you from heaven, then that means that your salvation is based on your efforts or lack thereof. And that doesn't fly. That flies in the face, actually, of what we see that we're saved by grace. Does that mean that we sin, that grace would abound? Paul addresses that too by says, of course not. Silly. That's a ridiculous thought. What we want to do is walk in a place of being right before God and pleasing to him. And whenever those kind of things come up, that we've done something that we just know that he would be dissatisfied with, it doesn't disqualify us from heaven. It just is something that, like with anything, if we've offended someone close to us that we love, we want that acknowledged, because it puts up a wall with us, not salvation. But I mean, it's like, man, if there's something that's gone on, we want to address it so that it takes away that kind of the conflict that is there by our actions. And so we remove that conflict by addressing it and coming before him. So it doesn't disqualify us, our particular things that we do, or else salvation will then be maintained by works that we do. So you can't earn your way into heaven. You don't earn your way out of it by actions. Now again, actions should follow. That's why we talk about sanctification or holiness, godliness, those kind of words. Those are things that are applied to the believer after they're saved. So as we walk with the Lord and we grow in him and we start to see the things that he would expect of us, we begin to walk accordingly. Again, it's the idea of peer pressure, but in the good way. So the more that I'm with him, the more that I spend time with him, the more that I say, your will, not mine, the more I'm going to be like he is. And that happens over time. And again, is it a daily struggle? You bet. I mean, we live in a world that is just bent on trying to get us to do the wrong thing. So those times are going to come in when I'm going to regret something that I've done. Doesn't disqualify me from heaven, but I want to take that to the Lord and say, I want to be able to look at you in the eye and not be ashamed. So I want to acknowledge those things, that there's something that's taken place. So anyway, we stay with what we know for sure. We are not saved by our works, so there's nothing that I will do by some singular thing that's going to disqualify me from heaven because I fell into whatever sin that might be. It could have real consequences, maybe even for a lifetime, but it doesn't disqualify me from heaven. So let's stay with what we know for absolutely sure. What the word says is that I am saved because of what he has done, not because of what I have done. I simply am to believe in his completed, finished work and for his forgiveness of my sin through the blood of his son. That's what the scripture says. Everything else has to be subordinate to that truth. That is the biggest of the big picture things. Everything else has to refer back to that. And if it somehow is contradictory to that, then what we're believing is incorrect. So let's stay with what we know. All right, good stuff. Hopefully that's understandable. For me, it's good stuff. Hopefully it works as well as you're concerned as well. Proverbs 13, really terrific proverb. There's a couple of places in here that we can maybe look in the New Testament and think, there's a possibility that the person writing what they were writing is reflecting on what was already said here. Now, let me back up for just a moment and make sure that I'm very careful about this. When we see the things that Solomon is writing here, I don't believe that Solomon is telling us things that are absolutely, 100%. This is complete doctrine and theology like we think of as with Paul. But I don't believe that it's in error either. Okay, so what we're seeing here is Solomon, led by the Holy Spirit, just kind of gleaning the things that he sees in the world around him, guided by the wisdom that God has given to him and knowledge. Because I don't find things in here that I disagree with. But I can definitely see where people would be reading these things, writers of the New Testament, they would be familiar with the things that Solomon had said. And there are some very, very useful things that are said here, very practical, easy to understand. But boy, do you see them expanded greatly when we look through the New Testament. So a book like Proverbs can tell us a lot about here's how God does what he does. Again, Solomon is saying these things on his own observation, but that observation that he would make, we should be able to say, we can come to the same observations, even more so than him, because we got a lot more history than he had to reflect back on. And we'll get a couple of examples of that. And man, it takes on such a different look when you're able to cast the light into the New Testament of what he's saying here and seeing if the Bible in the New Testament sense has similar things to say. So, sorry, it's cold here and there's stuff in the air. Hopefully I'm not having to clear my throat too often. I will try to get through this. So anyhow, Proverbs chapter 13, let's have a word of prayer. And we'll jump into this. Really, really a good proverb here. I keep thinking I'm going to start, getting through more than just one every time. And so far, I'm only getting through one proverb a week, and that'll be the case today. Father, we thank you so much for the time that we are able to spend in your word. Grateful for what you instruct us and for how you help us to understand what's being said here. The observations of a man that you gifted with wisdom and knowledge like none other. And we would pray that as we read these things, making application to our own lives, as we understand it historically, why he would say what he says, we pray that we would take the things learned here and apply them in our own lives successfully. We give you all thanks and praise in Jesus' name. All right. So the first three really kind of deal with verbal. And so if you know that I've been mentioning this, when we were looking at the first, several, the first, actually, gosh, it was probably the first 10 or whatever, they're much more thematic. They had like something that carried all the way through. And we're into those Psalms now, or Proverbs rather now, that are like, they might differ in scope from one verse to the next. They have some big themes to them, absolutely, because it's always going to be the big theme in these ones is that, well, the wise person does this, the foolish person does that, or the evil person versus the righteous person, they do this. That is pretty much something that carries through. But you wouldn't necessarily think that one verse runs on to the next in one continual thought. They're just usually one verse topical things that he says observationally. In the first three verses, we have things that really kind of look about the what can be done and what's expressed through words and even actions, but the resulting effect. So I'm going to read the first three and we'll go back and look at them individually. A wise man heeds his father's instruction, but a scoffer does not listen to rebuke. A man shall eat well by the fruit of his mouth, but the soul of the unfaithful feeds on violence. He who guards his mouth preserves his life, but he who opens wide his lips shall have destruction. So again, the actions follow words often. So if that's kind of a governing principle in this we know. Or if we look at it, what we see in the New Testament is Jesus would say, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. So that recognition that whatever's going on internally is going to be expressed externally through words or through actions or through both. So this is kind of what we're seeing here again in his observation. And so what Solomon would point out here, it should be something that you could look at in the real world, maybe your own experience or watching it in somebody else. You could say, yep, I know who that guy would be and that guy would be in the stories that I know from my own time, okay? Of spiritual matters or sometimes even just in the world among unbelievers, you'll see this, that people that there's somebody that's on the right side of a situation versus the wrong side of a situation, and what comes of it will be obvious to everyone who looks at it. So again, a wise son heeds the father's instruction, and so that's the direction that he would receive from his father. Now, it's said here as a father to a son, but really this goes well beyond even that, because there are those who would give instruction and those who would listen. The ones who would get instruction and would listen and act accordingly, this goes to the heart of what we would consider as discipleship. We want to go to the people who've been there and done that. And again, let me just finish out verse 2, and then verse 1, and I'll go back to this. But here's by the other option. But a scoffer, the person that's into mockery, that person will never listen to rebuke. Instead, when they're given correction or instruction, they're just going to mock because they don't want to hear it. Their pride is going to tell them they know better. Now, around the Calvary Chapel movement, it's been a body of churches that I've been a part of for, again, coming up on 40 years. I've never been to a church or part of a church that's not Calvary Chapel in all of my years as a believer. The first 35 of them, all at one church there in California in the city of Cypress. And since moving here, we attend a church here in Texas in Weatherford. Again, it's a Calvary Chapel. So my whole time has always been in Calvary Chapel. It's all that I have ever known. Now, as a pastor, I've been to a number of pastors' conferences. And I used to say it this way. I know that, again, they do conferences and pastors' conferences in particular. And there's been kind of a change that's taken place. They do a lot more to, bring up younger guys and this whole movement of trying to move towards younger guys. And I know that when that all started to take place, I thought, okay, that's all well and good, but some of these guys have been at it even less time than I had at that point. But I would want to look at the guys who've been through it. And as I put it this way, it's kind of like watching those stories or those shows where you're watching, the animals doing the things that they do. And I think of the lions. They're probably the best example of this. And man, you look at the pride males that would be the top animal in that pack, and you look at his face, he's got scars everywhere. Well, if we were able to see them, not necessarily going to be visible, but I'd like to go to the pastors who have the scars all over their face, because I want to know how they got those. I want to know how they survived the attack. I want to know what it was that caused the scar. What did God show them in the process? I want to go to or hear from those guys who've been through it. And I'm not there to hear sermons. I'm not there to hear what's the newest, coolest thing. None of that stuff matters. To me anyways, personally. I want to know what it takes, rubber meets the road ministry. And the guys that have been at it the longest and have seen the most are the ones that you can kind of get some wisdom from. In Solomon here, we've got kind of that same thing. The young person that he might be writing to, as he says, a son, might be somebody that's in their adolescence, their late teens, early 20s, whatever it may be. We don't know. But they're still in a place of being discipled from a person who's seen a lot and been there. Plus, he's gifted as the one that God has given this wisdom and knowledge to. And he's the king of the nation over which they're the sons. They're the young men. So he's got a lot to say. Now, there are those who will hear it, and they will not be so filled with their own pride as to say, I can learn something from this person. It'd be better that I learn than find it out of myself the hard way. Or the person that's just kind of self-assured and filled with pride. Well, we see what those people are like. These are the people that will never listen to a rebuke, meaning that there has to be correction here. So then in verse 2, a man will eat well by the fruit of his mouth, but the soul of the unfaithful feeds on violence. And so, once again, this is that idea of the things believed, the things spoken, and the things that are done. So you're going to have the contrast of the person that will eat well. Again, this is not because it's not that you're begging for food here or something that you're saying from your mouth. That's the only way that you're going to eat. He's using that in the metaphoric sense. So a person, how it is that they conduct themselves and the things that are coming out of their mouths, the things that they are saying, is going to have a direct reflection on the quality of life is what's being spoken of here. Verse 3, he who guards his mouth preserves his life, but he who opens wide his lips will have destruction. So that means just because it's on your mind doesn't mean that it needs to be heard. There are some things that discretion would say, yeah, I might be right in this whole thing, but saying something, it doesn't mean concealing and hiding things, but I don't need to just put it out there for everyone to hear. It's not necessary that everybody has to be in on it and make their own judgments without knowledge. Because again, think about this. How many times we might say something and have an opinion about something and express that, but what led us to that opinion could be volumes of other information that there's no reason for us to disclose that. We keep it all to ourselves. It's not everybody's business. Well, there are some people that can't help themselves. They just got to blurt out everything that comes into mind. And the people listening to it without any kind of knowledge are just going to be kind of sullied through it all. That's the problem. They just have to say what's on your mind, and it's not necessarily to the benefit of others. Verse 4, the soul of a lazy man desires but has nothing, and the soul of the diligent shall be made rich. That's pretty obvious what he's getting here. It's the sluggish person. There's no initiative. There's no drive. There's nothing in that person. And the soul of that person, who of the lazy man, they're going to desire, but they'll have nothing for it. So again, that idea, I want all these things, but I'm not willing to labor for it. Okay, we get that. And this doesn't have to be spiritual. This is just an observation about humanity as a whole. There's people that want everybody to do whatever for them. They're not willing to do it for themselves, and they're going to always be in that place of lack, as opposed to the soul of the diligent that will be made rich. They will have something to show for, and this doesn't mean that they're going to be rich necessarily. It could be, but it's not saying here's the way to get rich and that's the way to stay poor, because it can be even non-material kinds of things. Think about applying this in the spiritual sense. The person that has no desire to care about the things of God, very limited intake, if you will. They're lazy, sluggish, there's no initiative, no drive. Well, you're going to get what you put in. So this could be, it has a spiritual application as well. But the soul of the diligent will be made rich. So if I think about what we read in Hebrews 12:6, speaking of Enoch, or 11, I should say, it says that anybody who comes to the Lord must believe that he is, but he's a rewarder of those who diligently seek after him. So you can make a spiritual application to this, or it's just in the world around you. Okay, if you're going to have some fun with this, of course, it doesn't necessarily translate into some governments which seem to reward lazy people. Verse 5. A righteous man hates lying, but a wicked man is loathsome and comes to shame. Interestingly enough, the lying that's mentioned in the first part of this is not what's mentioned in the last part, but you can't help but disconnect, or I'm sorry, you can't disconnect them. I believe that they're connected. So that idea of lying can be how you conduct, the things that you say, the things that you do. You can live a lie just as well as you can speak it. So if that's the case, and everything that goes along with it, because you might be living a lie and it's going to show outwardly just as much as you would be saying it verbally. And if that's the case here, which I believe that's what Solomon's getting to, a righteous man hates the fruit of lying, whether it's the thing that is said or all the collateral stuff that comes with it. There's supposed to be a hatred that we have for that kind of being dishonest that's being spoken of here. And of course, the second part of that, but a wicked man is loathsome and comes to shame. So a person that lives that way, again, if it's a lie and everything that goes along with it, the righteous man is going to hate that. Can't stand the resulting effect of it. I don't want any part of it. The other part is, again, a man that is loathsome comes to a shame. It's going to be something that if he's going to participate in those things, rather than hating it and avoiding it, they'll participate in it and it will be to their shame. They're going to be found out that they are that person. In verse 6, righteousness guards him whose way is blameless, but wickedness overthrows the sinner. I love the wording in this, that righteousness guards. It's like keeps watch. It's vigilant. It's watching over and keeping guard, if you will. There's the idea of protection, or even a blockade, that it puts up a barrier and keeps away. So righteousness guards the man or him whose way is blameless. And we've gone into this, the idea of blameless versus sinless. It's just a great play on words, but it means a lot. Nowhere and at no time would you ever look at me saying I am a man who is sinless, because all of us, it's going to happen. You're going to do something that falls short of the glory of God. Romans 3:23, all sin falls short of the glory of God, period. There's no one who gets out. That's just the way that it is. But that doesn't mean that I have to wallow in sin. I can come before the Lord who cleanses me, and though sin is there, God would look at it and say, and yet Jesus has paid that price. That man stands before me blameless, and the matter of sin, which is ever present, is already forgiven in the blood of Jesus. And yet, here's the opposite. But the wickedness but wickedness overthrows. Or the effect of wickedness, when you see the word overthrows, it means it overturns. It brings and reduces them to wreckage. They're just destroyed by it. The wickedness, but wickedness overthrows the sinner. There is one who makes himself rich or feigns that. They claim to have all of these things, yet has nothing, and one who makes himself poor, yet he has great riches. Interestingly enough, it can't be speaking of material things, because a person can claim poverty. If you make the spiritual application, this makes much more sense in what's being said here. Because when he talks about that the person makes himself, that means that's their own assessment. And so they feign this. I've got everything that I could have in a spiritual sense. And yet, when there's one who makes that himself rich, the truth is that he has nothing. And so again, if this applies to a particular person, they may claim things, but in reality, it's something that's completely different. It's about self-assessment. And if that's the case, and I believe that's what Solomon's getting here, then there's a person who's not so filled with their own pride and reading, if you will, their own press clippings. They would look and say, yeah, but there's none of us that are perfect, and they have a genuine, real assessment. There's riches that's found in that because they don't think so highly of themselves. They rather look to the Lord for any esteeming that could be done, not themselves. So verse 8, the ransom of a man's life is his riches, but the poor does not hear rebuke. Interesting, there's a couple of ways that people look at this. And again, which one is what Solomon's saying? This is one of those kind of places where it could mean one thing or it could mean another entirely, but we have no comment on it. And could I make the case for both of these being true, both of these possibilities? Let's look at what they could be. Verse 8, the ransom of a man's life is in his riches. Now that means, the ransom means if something comes against him, he has the means by which he's able to meet that need. So a rich person, if it's in the material sense, if a person is materially rich and somebody comes after him, he's able to buy back whatever it is that he's being accused of because he has means. The second part, but the poor does not hear such a rebuke. Nobody's going to go after the poor person, so they don't ever have to worry about that. Now, so if it's just purely in the material sense, which I don't believe that's where Solomon's getting at, but you can make the case. You're not going to go after the poor guy. He doesn't have anything to go after. You'll go after the rich guy. We watch that take place in our world all the time. If it's meant in the purely materialistic sense, this makes perfect sense. Go after the rich guy. He's got plenty to cover himself, and he'll be able to pay the price of it. Where the poor guy, you can go after him all you want to, but what's that old saying? You can't get blood out of a turnip. Well, if this is meant instead in the sense of spiritual wealth or lack thereof, a person spiritually can ransom themselves, whatever the accusation may be, then they're able by their own action and their own life to be able to say, look, I don't have a problem paying, if you will, what it takes for me to defend myself against the accusation. Because there's a multitude of, or wealth, if you will, of your personal spiritual well-being, that whatever that may be, when people examine it, there's no lack. You're able to take care of, or you're able to repel, or as a way of looking at it metaphorically as a payment, I can cash that check. Let people look through my life. There's no spiritual poverty here. Whatever the accusation is, it's going to come out that it's untrue what the accusation is. As opposed to the other person, the poor does not hear the rebuke. But the person that's in a place of spiritual poverty, they're going to be able to hear what's said against them, and they have no way of being able to defend themselves against it. So make your own, you can say, I can make the case for both of those. And I try to do that very briefly, but you can see the principle in that whole thing. And actually, you can see it even in the New Testament sense, where that idea that when people speak evil against you, that there would be no evidence. Peter talks about that. Paul talks about it. The case is that people may say all kinds of evil against you, but if it's ever examined, they'll never be able to prove the point. They did it against Paul. They did it against Jesus. They tried to bring accusations against them, and the people bringing the accusations, under examination, it all fell apart. Interesting. Verse 9, the light of the righteous rejoices, but the lamp of the wicked will be put out. So clearly this is about the way that a person's actions are going to be able to shine forth, if you will. And when I read this, I think this is Beatitudes to me. This is similitudes. This is right after it when he talks about when you get a light, you don't put it under a bushel, you put it in the center of the room and it gives light to everything else that's in the room. Or if it's the city on a hill, it cannot be hidden. It gives illumination. It's in verse 17 of Matthew 5 where Jesus ends up saying, so let your light so shine before man that they would see your good works, the way that you conduct yourself, and they will glorify your Father who is in heaven. So once again, how is it that we conduct ourselves? It's basically the same principle. Was Jesus thinking about Solomon and what he had said here, or is it just, axiomatic? It's just a truth. And whether it's Solomon or Jesus or anyone else, they can basically make the same statement. The light of the righteous rejoices, or it shines forth in glory or in rejoicing or in the shouting forth of joyful things, as opposed to the lamp of the wicked, and it will be put out, extinguished. There's nothing there. It doesn't give off any illumination. There's no light in it. So either way, you can see this just plays out in the lives of people. It's obvious what's being said here, and especially when we take it in light of what Jesus had to say there in Matthew 5. So by pride, verse 10, comes nothing but strife, but with the well-advised there is wisdom. Now in verse 10, we understand what pridefulness does, and so it's the result of pride. It comes nothing but there's going to be strife. It's quarreling, it's arguing, it's bickering and fighting. That's what's going to come. Pride, because you can't tell me, I know what I'm doing, and you're going to go ahead and argue your point because you want people to think as you, in your own assessment, nobody knows better than me, I'm the only one who's right. Verse 10, but with the well-advised there is wisdom. So people that will not rely on their own internal counsel, but they will come before a number of people and seek wisdom and advice and counsel and all that stuff. For the person who does that, the well-advised, there is wisdom. There is peace, contentment, knowledge. You don't lean on your own understanding, which we've already heard Solomon talk about, but you'll acknowledge God in all your ways. So once again, we know that God puts people in our lives. This goes, again, to the very heart of discipleship. God puts people in our lives that we would be well informed before we take any actions, as opposed to the person that's going to say, me, myself, and I am my own authority, and it's a hill I'm going to die on, pleading my case. Verse 11, wealth gained by dishonesty will be diminished, but he who gathers by labor will increase. Very simple to understand. If you do whatever you do by dishonest gains, you're going to lose it as quickly as you made it, because God's not going to be okay with it. Remember, Solomon has already told us that God, it's an abomination, these unfair scales, the idea that you're not being honest about you're weighing out something for its value. So again, but the person who labors, that God is going to honor the person that does an honest day's wage and earns, he's going to be rewarded. Now this is again Solomon speaking about the way that it's supposed to be, and it should be in the nation that he's the king over. This is how God looks at these things. Does that mean that when man can take over and doesn't care about the things of God, that they can do all kinds of horrible things that would shoot through this? Absolutely. The world is unjust. Man is unjust. This is the ideal. This is the way that it's supposed to be. So wealth gained by dishonesty will be diminished. It won't be there forever. So if we look at this and make the forever in this, you would ask yourself, of the people that are the worst by defrauding everybody that there is, that they come in contact with, whatever they might gain through it, they won't go into the next life. They're going to have to give account for it. Verse 12, oh, I love this one. Hope deferred makes the heart sick, but when the desire comes, it is a tree of life. So let's look at this in the biggest of pictures. There are so many things that you can hope for. And whatever it is that you hope for, that if it doesn't come to pass when you're expecting it, it just is such a downer. It makes the heart sick. It's grieved. However, when that thing that you hope for the most, when it finally comes to pass, it is just like a tree that gives forth life. It refreshes the soul, and it makes things the way that they're supposed to be. This is something that from my earliest of years, I remember my pastor Jack talking about this, and I love this, the way that he would talk about it, especially when it came to that idea of like the rapture and us being gathered to him, those kind of things. The problem that people get into by trying to set dates about the rapture and all the rest of that, they're just so sure that it's going to take place, and then it comes and goes, and people are just bothered that it didn't happen like it was supposed to happen. We got ourselves so excited about it, and they walk away dejected and sad, of course, having egg on their face. But the worst part about it is that think about the reaction that it has to the heart and mind, because they got themselves so wrapped up in one particular thing that they thought for sure was going to take place at a particular time, and it didn't. Well, that's hope deferred, because their hope was this is going to take place, and this is when, all the way down the line, they're just absolutely sure of it. That day comes and goes. What happens to those people? So some people don't have enough of a conscience to say, I was wrong, I'll never do that again. Other ones just kind of, become saddened by the whole thing, as though somehow maybe even God has failed. Now, I don't, there's been a lot of that kind of stuff of recent, but let me go back over the years that I can remember. And people that were sure that the rapture was going to happen 20 years ago, 30 years ago, it didn't happen. And they got to that place of complacency. Some, I can think of it as I'm saying all this, I'm looking at it in my mind. And I just watched their lives after that point. They were so excited, this is what's going to happen. There's so much going on around the world. It's about to take place. The Lord's coming back. And he didn't. So what happened to them? So I watched some who became disillusioned by it. Other ones who said, well, maybe we got out ahead of ourselves. The Lord's not coming back anytime soon. And they got very much just entrenched in just the day-to-day of things. They lost the urgency that's there. And there was a lot to be learned from that. I'll put myself in this place and say, have I gotten to the point where I'm just saying, hey, look, the Lord could be here today? Am I still in that place of the same excitement? Absolutely. That hasn't changed in all the years since I even understood that the Lord could return at any moment. But I'm not bothered by the fact that he doesn't today, because that means that there are still things that he's going to do. So that hope is not deferred in me. That hope is every single day. It's not deferred because it didn't happen today. It's going to happen eventually. So when I'm going to see him face to face, that date's known to him and him alone. Whether that's my physical body ceases to function and I go before him that way, or if he comes back at the rapture, whatever that is, however that takes place, that timing's not up to me. So I'm not going to see that deferred. I'm not impatient waiting for it. I'm supposed to wait for it with patience, because the day that comes, that I do see him face to face, tree of life. It's that idea that I have been just released from whatever these bonds are, and it is something that will be, celebrated. So that can work with the simplest of things, or it can work all the way up to us coming to see the Lord face to face. What Solomon is referring to here seems to be much more temporary. He doesn't know the world that we live in right now. He doesn't know Jesus. He doesn't know well, at the time of writing, he didn't know, but he didn't have that expectation that the Lord's coming back for us. It could be today. But this principle fits in all those things. We don't want to get ourselves so invested on any one particular thing that when it comes and goes, that somehow our lives are broken because it didn't happen as we had thought. So it's the idea of playing the long game in our hearts and minds. Verse 13, he who despises the word will be destroyed, but he who fears the commandment will be rewarded. Again, just love how this is. The person that despises what the Lord has to say. Remember, again, we're supposed to be obedient to what his word has to say to us. So the person who looks at the word of God and is not put off by what it has to say, but rather is encouraged by it, that's the first part of this part. He who despises the word will be destroyed. We're not that person. So the person that does not want to hear what the Lord has to say or take his counsel, that person will come to destruction. However, he who fears the commandment will be rewarded. So fears or has reverence for what God has put forth, that person is going to have reward for those things. So again, Solomon couldn't have possibly understood it as in terms that we do. It's just not the world that he lives in. He doesn't know how salvation works as we do, because there's so much more that we know because of time going by. And again, he's writing from 1,000 years before Jesus comes onto the scene. We're looking at it 2,000 years back. We know how this thing ends. But the understanding is that there's a person who will despise what God's word has to say and reject it entirely, and they're going to come to ruin, as opposed to the person who embraces it. So pretty easy to see how that is. But again, these two verses, 12 and 13, just think of how different they sound to your ear when you think about them in terms of who we are in the Lord and what's been revealed to us. You can see Solomon was onto something here, but boy, he couldn't have possibly understood the depths of such simple statements seen through the eyes of the New Testament. Really, really cool stuff. Verse 24, the law, here's again, one of those things, works perfectly in the New Testament. The law of the wise is a fountain of life and to turn one away from the snares of death. The law, the word here, law, is Torah. Now, it doesn't mean that he's referring to the law of Moses, the Torah of the 5 books of Moses. The law is just something that's the governing principle. It's the law. It's the thing that's been put in writing, and it's for us to understand. So just think, it's the governing principle, or it's the governing thing of our life. So if we're looking at it like that, it doesn't have to refer to the 5 books of Moses when we hear Torah or law, because again, if you see, it's the law of the wise. So what governs the wise? The law of the wise, to him, what does it represent? A fountain of life. There's vibrancy to it. It's alive. There's life to it, as opposed to, it's supposed to turn one away from the snares of death. So the people who don't have regard and are not governed by God, what's their final, what's going to happen to them? They're the ones who are going to have to deal with the snares of death, but not for the believer, the one who is governed by God and the things that he would have to say. What's the governing principle or the governing person behind us? Of course, it's the Lord, and he has communicated to us those things that are acceptable and that we should do and what's pleasing to him. Good understanding gains favor, but the way of the unfaithful is hard. And this is in a continual sense, as he says this, the verb itself. This is at all times. It's always this way. Good understanding gains favor. And the understanding is taking those things that you've known, learned, applying wisdom, doing what you're supposed to. That person is going to gain favor. Of course, it begs the question. Does it gain favor with man or with God? Which one is it? And you could just say simply both. We get that same principle in the teaching of the New Testament, that again, we're to live peaceably among all people, that whenever they try to bring something against you, there's just no merit to it. We're going to be able to gain favor. And so again, good understanding, taking what we've been told, applying wisdom, doing accordingly, that's going to gain us favor with God and man. However, by contrast, the way of the unfaithful is hard, and it's that way continually. They're always going to be struggling to get by, if you will, let alone that they're not going to be in the place of rightness before God. So verse 16, every prudent man acts with knowledge, and prudent just means shrewd. And shrewd doesn't need to be a negative thing, but it's like you take into account every potential thing and you realize, if I do this, that could have some really bad consequence. This would be the wise thing to do because it's biblical. It's clearly God wouldn't have a problem with it. It's being shrewd. It's being analytical, thinking through it, not just, knee-jerk, not just ready, fire, aim. Taking your time to work through it. Every prudent man acts with knowledge. There's a shrewdness to him. However, a fool lays open his folly. There's no discretion. They just act, don't even think about whatever's going to happen, and it ends up blowing up in their face. A wicked messenger falls into trouble, and the word messenger is sometimes translated into angel. So this is that same word that's used very commonly in the Old Testament, and it means a messenger, a person who is bringing a message. Could sometimes translated angel. This is just in the very generic sense, the person who's delivering, if you will, a message. A wicked messenger falls into trouble, and so they're going to be snared by the same things. They have ulterior motives to the things that they're doing. They're wicked, and the things that they're saying as their message, it's going to come back on them. But a faithful ambassador, similar kind of a word, but think of what an ambassador does. An ambassador is a representative of someone else. More so than just a messenger. A faithful ambassador brings about health, the end result of what is their message and who they're a messenger for. The implication is a person that's sent on a godly mission as an ambassador of his. The resulting effect of them is going to bring health or good things. It's going to be of a benefit to the person hearing. Poverty and shame will come to him who disdains correction, but he who regards a rebuke will be honored. So even the idea of rebuke means that it can be something that's not easy to hear. What's going to be the result, again, is there's a person that will disdain any kind of correction. What will come to them? Poverty of whether it's material or of spiritual things. They're going to be in a place of deficit and lack, as opposed to the one who regards rebuke. That person will be honored. God will see to it. It doesn't have to be the honor of men. It means that God will not see that that goes unnoticed. They will have something to show for their obedience, even if it means that it having to take correction. The end result is that it works to the benefit of the person. They'll be honored for that. Verse 19, a desire accomplished is sweet to the soul, but it is an abomination to fools to depart from their evil. So again, the difference of the evil person as opposed to the one that is right in this, doing the things as God would have them to do. A desire rather accomplished is sweet to the soul, because it's whatever it is, it's a noble cause, and once it's done, it's because it's a right thing, and the person, once they come to the end of that, the assumption here is that it's something that's God honoring and that he's given direction for it. It comes to pass, and there is great, it's sweet to even to the soul, what makes the man themselves. But it is an abomination to fools to depart from evil. So the evil person doesn't want anything to do with escaping or with pursuing after the right things. All that they want to do is to pursue after evil. The implication is the person was pursuing after right and honorable things, and that's been shown. It's able to be recognized. The evil person that's in this part here, they see that and want no part of what's right and acceptable to God. In fact, that would be an abomination to that. To that person that's evil, they see the thing that's good and they hate it. They have disdain for it. He who walks with wise men will be wise, but the companion of fools will be destroyed. And this is that ultimate story of peer pressure. What do you do, and the people that you're around, how do you conduct yourself? And ultimately, this is the problem that you have all too often, that people, and I heard this so many times, oh my gosh, this happens so often in dating. It's just a great example of this. The person that's a right-on believer at the time and wants to start dating somebody who's not a believer. And they say, if I can get the time to be with them, they'll understand and they'll come to the Lord themselves. And so they're going to, keep up the brave face. They're going to do the right thing, and the person's going to be won to the Lord because of their conduct. And I usually find that it's the total opposite. And so the problem is, it's much easier to do the wrong thing than it is to do the right thing. And if the person that you're hanging around with is always going to be pulling in a different direction, it really has this effect that it tends to drag the person that walks rightly before the Lord. It drags them down. So it's just a principle. He who walks with wise men will be wise. Peer pressure. They're going to be like the people that they are around. But the companion of fools will be destroyed. It's going to come to their disillusionment, their destruction. So it's the idea of picking your friends. This is what we want to tell our kids all the time. Consider the people that you're hanging out with, because they're going to have a direct effect upon you. So this is just as obvious and age-old as anything could possibly be. Evil pursues the sinner, but to the righteous good shall be repaid. So pretty obvious. What's the wages of sin? Death. That's what Paul would tell us in Romans 6:23. Same kind of a principle. Evil pursues sinners. What are sinners going to get in the end of things? It's going to be evil. It's to their destruction. It's to their harm. But to the righteous, good will be repaid. So walk rightly before God. God will see to it that you are rewarded. And we don't want to think about this in a material sense. This is more in the way of relationship, because again, evil is what awaits the person who would reject those things. The people who accept it are going to get, and that's that whole idea about reaping the whirlwind, sowing to the flesh. You're going to, of the flesh, reap corruption. New Testament sense. That is just, again, such an easy principle. What are you sowing to? What are you putting your efforts into? And what is going to be the result of it? Pretty obvious, pretty easy. Verse 22 says, a man leaves an inheritance to his children's children, but the wealth of the sinner is stored up for the righteous. Interesting thing here. Because again, this is one of those little quips that he makes here that you go, yeah, it looks a little bit different to his eye, I think, than it might be to ours. Because again, think about who he is and his audience. The idea that they're a God-governed people, that he's a king and, a king of a nation, that God is, he has the ear through the prophets and through the kings, whether they acknowledge it or not. They're hearing this all the time. They're hearing what God would want them to hear through the kings and through the people who are around them, if the nation's operating the way that it's supposed to. But we see this, and again, this is the ideal. This is how it should be. In the real world, especially in the days in which we live, when most governments and most people in the way that they conduct themselves as a nation don't conduct themselves this way. And it seems to be almost contradictory to what reality is. So there are times that what we want to do is say, there's the ideal, this is how it should be. And if everything is as it's supposed to be, this is going to be the outcome, but man can corrupt this. So a good man leaves an inheritance for his children's children. So whatever it is that he produces, he keeps what he needs for himself, but he's going to pass it on to the next group of people. But in the perfect world, the way that it should be, but the wealth of the sinner is stored up for the righteous. It will find its way back to a right person. Even the people who come to it by ill-gotten gain or whatever, the wicked, eventually everything that they labor for is never going to be passed along. God will not see it. It'll just make its way back to the right person or to the righteous. So much food is in the fallow ground of the poor, and for lack of justice there is waste. Interesting. That's interesting how this is worded, and it kind of loses a little bit in the English. So let's look at it real quick. Much food is in the fallow ground of the poor. Fallow is that which has just been tilled. So a person, though they may not have all kinds of wealth or whatever else it is, might have just their little plot of land, but if they till it and they take care of it, it's going to yield fruit. Now again, there's a spiritual way that you can look at this as well. I think he's trying to just say in the world in which they live, in the real world, you can see this about the person who has an investment in what it is that they have, and they toil, they work at what it is that they own. However, for the lack of justice, and for lack of justice, there is waste. So the person who might have a whole lot, there's going to be waste in that because it's just the way that justice would work. That man will not labor for what is his, even though he might have more than the poor person. There's no effort, there's no anything that goes into it, and yet so at the end of it, they have nothing to show for it. So if we look at that also in the spiritual sense, there might be a person who might not have all the means that some might think, but if they are really putting their mind towards the labor of walking after the Lord, they till the ground, they work at it, there is never going to be a lack. They will have plenty. The person who neglects those things and can't make a just way of, making a judicious kind of decision, if you will, of how to walk and if they should walk rightly before the Lord, they will have that place of ruin. There won't be anything to show for their labor. Verse 24. He who spares his rod hates his son, but he who loves him disciplines him promptly. Now, this is something that you hear from Solomon a lot. This idea of discipline and the things that should come of the relationship. Again, when we hear rod, this also is the same word for scepter. So again, there's a couple of ways that this is looked at. When rod, if it's meaning the scepter or the things that a person might have in their hand, you don't beat your kids with those things. Could that mean that the scepter is what represents the idea of the authority and that there is some kind of punishment that comes? The parent who loves their kids is going to have to come to the place of if there is punishment. There has to be consequence for the things that they do that's wrong. Now again, in our world today, especially in our country, the idea of corporal punishment is really frowned upon. Didn't always used to be that way. And so here, this really does give the impression that there is some kind of punishment that takes place. And is it physical in nature? I don't picture a guy with a staff just beating on his kids. That's such a misrepresentation of what's there. So again, we can put aside all of it, whether it has to be in the sense corporal punishment, but the idea is correction above everything else, because clearly God doesn't correct us in that way. He doesn't beat us over with anything, doesn't have any kind of a physical staff a rod or a staff that he's beating on us. But does that mean that he doesn't give us correction? Well, Hebrews 12 tells us that he does that. And so Hebrews would tell us that just like any parent, if you love your children, you're going to chasten them. If there's a time when they need correction, correction will be brought. That's the bigger picture here. How it's actually done is less important, especially depending on what society is doing. But the idea of bringing correction, teaching right and wrong, consequence for bad behavior, all of that stuff needs to be done. The one who spares his rod hates his own son. If there's no correction, if there's no consequence for bad behavior, and there's never anything that's going to cost the person doing it, then he equates that with you don't care at all for your kid. You hate them because you're doing them such a horrible injustice and a disservice. Second part of that, but he who loves him disciplines him promptly, doesn't let it go very long. And again, you've all been there. Everybody who's hearing, and hopefully you study all the way through these studies, you've been in the places. We see it more often. I see it more often in the stores than anywhere else. Kids just losing their minds, doing all kinds of insane things, and the parents not even caring about it. They don't care what a nuisance their kid is. They don't care how loud they are. They don't care how rude they are. And you would want to go up to them and say, why don't you go take a walk down that other aisle? Let me take care of your kid for a bit. I'm not going to beat them up, but I'm going to tell them what discipline is. I'm going to get right in there, eye to eye, looking at them and telling them what they're doing is unacceptable, since the parents won't do it. Of course, you can't. You never would, but you'd like to. So the idea that you look at your kid in the eye and say, what you're doing is completely unacceptable. I'm not going to have you doing this. I love you too much to let you continue to be this monster that you are, so you bring correction. That's ultimately what's being spoken of here. Verse 25. The righteous eats to the satisfying of his own soul, but the stomach of the wicked will be in a place of want. And it's similar to a few things he's already said here. Again, the person who is diligent, who takes pride in what they do, not proudful people, but I mean they actually put in the work, if you will. There's going to be a satisfaction to that. Not only that God would see that he rewards that, but there's also that sense at the end of the day, I didn't come by this because I took it from someone else. I didn't get it through any other means other than I did what was right and honorable, and God blesses it, as opposed to the person who refuses to do such things and would look for some other means. Notice how many times he's said basically the same type of thing, different words, but he's saying basically the same thing. The person who labors for something will have the reward of that labor. The person who does not is going to be found in a place of want and desire, and they'll never be satisfied. So you can make spiritual application to this. You can make physical application to it. In most of these, you can have both sides of that. So was it his intention that you would be able to look at it and say, that could mean this, or it could mean this, or it could mean both? Again, the idea of looking at the word from every conceivable aspect and seeing how it might work out in the whole, always very, very helpful to us. So, Proverbs 13. We get to Proverbs 14 next week. If you have any questions about any of what I shared, then you know how to get in touch with me through the ministry's website, oldpaththeology.net. And once again, feel free, if there's some kind of a question like the one I addressed at the beginning here, something that you'd say, I'd love to just get a few minutes of an answer and see what Chris's take is on something like that. Or if it's a Bible question that you just haven't been able to resolve for yourself, let's take a look at it, and we will do so. I'd love the suggestions and would love to work through them with you. So we pick up at Proverbs 14 next Thursday.